Good evening, one and all, to this, the sixth debate of term. Our focus this evening is going to be on the act of church-going. But before we get on to the debate, I think it's incumbent of me to convey our deepest sympathies with the Ukrainian people at this time. There will be a debate on Tuesday next week where members will get to voice their views on this subject. But for now, I would like simply to say that I'm sure all of our thoughts are with the Ukrainian people at this time, and also with all those Ukrainians at the university and those Russians here at the university and in Russia who want peace. And I'd like to invite you all to join me in a minute's silence before we commence proceedings this evening. Thank you. The motion before the House this evening is this House would go to church. And I'm delighted to introduce the first speaker for the proposition, Nicholas Lear. Nick is studying for a Master of Law at Sydney Sussex College. He was also in a past life the Secretary of the Oxford Union. He won this slot through open audition. Nick, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President. It is a real honour to be speaking in this debate tonight. And as you've already outed me as the former Secretary of the Other Places Union, I am on enemy territory a little bit now, so I would like to pay a little compliment to this place and say it's a great honour to be in the older establishment of the two. I was actually here 10 years ago during a sixth form law conference, and that gives you some idea of my age, by the way. Those of you wondering, he looks rather old to be a fresher. I can tell you I'm less fresh now than I was then, certainly. And that night was a fascinating debate. It was about the legalization of marijuana, presided over by Graham Virgo, who now holds a loftier position than he did then. And I'm fairly certain if the debate was that this evening, that my proposition teammates would be on opposite sides. But fortunately, they're not. I can join in the collective force of their advocacy in the defense of going to church tonight. Now, before I turn to the substantive arguments that I wish to make, there are some provisos I want to lay out, delimiting the parameters of my contribution. First of all, I will be speaking from the perspective and experience of being an Anglican. It would be inapposite of me, I suggest, to comment on other churches with which I am less familiar. Secondly, my arguments operate from the premise that you do not need to believe in order to go to church. And this is important because the motion this evening is this house would go to church. It is not this house would be religious, this house would believe in God, etc. You may think there is a corollary there, but I argue they are distinct. And thirdly, the operative word in this motion is would, because it imports an element of choice. If the motion read, this house must go to church, then I wouldn't be stood here, because I do not believe in compulsion, and I'm very certain that my fellow proposition speakers will not either. Now, with that being said, the conditional presupposition of the motion lends itself to all of you this evening, and it's great to see such a packed chamber, by the way, making a free and volitional choice about which door to walk through. And I'm here to persuade you, along with my proposition teammates, that on the balance, considering the arguments put before you, you should say yes to going to church. But it might be helpful if we actually ask ourselves, what do we mean by going to church? Quite open-ended, isn't it? Do we mean regular attendance with deep conviction, deep religious worship, or do we mean attendance when we wish to? Do we mean every day? Do we mean once a month, once a year? Again, or do we mean simply when we wish to? And my arguments operate from the premise of the latter on both occasions. So turning to my substantive arguments then, like any seasoned competitive debater, I have three. Here we go. And I've got nice catchphrases for them. The cultural, the communal, and the emotional. So I start with the cultural. And this is perhaps the highfalutin argument, but I suggest that there are innumerable cultural benefits to church-going and the act of church-going. And I want to ask you a question. Just think, if you're visiting a city in a predominantly Christian country, what is the first building you want to see? It's the cathedral. It's the church, right? Now, sure, I give way.
Are you drawing a differentiation between walking into a building and going to a service to worship if you believe to connect with God? You're not drawing a distinction between that.
I'm suggesting actually that what we want to do is to go into a service. I'm just about to come on to the aesthetic magnificence of the buildings from within, complemented by the service that you can enjoy by going to church. So I'll get to that point, but I appreciate your intervention. So as magnificently aesthetic and beautiful churches, chapels, cathedrals are from the outside, we can really understand their value from within. And the best way of doing that is by attending a service. And, as I said, I operate from the basis that you do not need to believe in order to go to a service. I want to ask you this as well. How many of you in this room have actually been to your college chapel to a service? Okay, fair number. Okay, all right. I've got not so much persuading to you. Yes, I give way.
My college doesn't have a chapel.
Okay. It's a fair point. I mean, I don't know what to say to that, apart from, but go to another one. I appreciate it. Well, on that, I would say, first of all, I recommend to you, this is my point, I recommend to you to go to your chapel, another chapel, and by doing so, you can experience the cultural benefits of church-going. Now, while you're there, you can see, and we are in a place, by the way, there are very few places on this planet where you can experience the cultural benefits of church-going so profoundly as in this city, because this university, this great university, has some of the best, I'm here now, nay, the best organists and choirs that the country has to offer. You can experience all in 1 week the hallowed compositions from your Birds and Taluses to your Parrys and Stanfords, although I'm not so much of a fan of Stanford personally. But on that, liturgical music is some of the finest that's ever been created, and sometimes the boat is pushed even further afield, beyond the reassuring predictability of evensong's Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis, as great as it is. And further still, when you are in that space, listening to a sermon, which may be interesting, may not, listening to readings, biblical in their fashion, which tell lessons, important lessons, which, regardless of your faith, you can, I think, have a stake in. Lessons of forgiveness, of kindness, of charity, at the heart of the church message. And the music, while simultaneously gazing up at the frescoes, the stained glass, the stone, you share in the centuries-old walled past that envelops and makes meaningful the experience of church-going. And please. Yeah. It's a good point. You're asking me to move on to my communal argument, I can tell. And I'll come to it. And I agree. I mean, there is a distinction. You can privately worship, you can privately... But the point I'm making here is I'm trying to as it were, take a broader approach to this motion to open up the offering of church-going to more than those that simply believe in God, okay? So I work from this premise, and I would say to that, on the communal benefits, well, I could proffer numerous personal and normative arguments. Personally, I've made numerous friends from being involved with chapel choirs, attending services. I could proffer the example of my grandmother, 94 last week, whose sense of belonging, whose sense of fulfillment of life is derived so acutely from the church community around which her life operates. Now, of course, she is from an older generation, but I love the fact that when I attend services with her, she knows everyone in her congregation. She knows the verges. In fact, she gets very excited when there's a new member of the congregation. It's like, blimey, who's this? And it's wonderful that they look out for her, she looks out for them, and by extension, they also look out for her family. Now, that story could be told millionfold, and there are other communal benefits to going, of course. The benefits of being tapped into a wider network. We live in an age where the self, quite rightly, is an important point. But we also, I believe, want to be tapped into a wider meaning of society, a community around which action can be orientated to help support people from across our local community. And the Church of England, for instance, through its Community Action Project, actively promotes churches, and I know that this is the case of college chapels. I'm sorry, my friend up there, you'll have to go to one with a chapel, that want to help the local community with issues from homelessness, loneliness, to recycling and integrating ethnic minorities in the community. And you might say, of course, well, I'm waiting for it. The rebuttal is going to come. Well, declining numbers, the number of congregation is shrinking, and surely we could do all this on a secular basis. We don't need a church. Why do we need a church to organise this sort of community action? Well, I would say to that quite simply is, why do away with a ready-made, or as our rather disgraced Prime Minister, oven-ready institution might say, focal point around which to organise community action? And conscious of time, I turn to my final argument, which is the emotional. And this is the heart of the debate, no pun intended. And this is the point that I think is important, is that there is no place, I would argue, that evokes the same qualities of safety, security, and sanctuary as the place of a church, and indeed a religious building, depending on your faith. Thank you. William James, dubbed the father of... I'm sorry, sir, I would love to come to you, but with a minute remaining, I'm pushed for time, I'm afraid. If I'm generously given more time, then I would gladly come to you. William James, dubbed the American founder of psychology, suffered during his early years with depression, quite significantly. And he wrote in his Varieties of Religious Experience about how church-going represented a remedial, a restorative, a recuperative impact on his life. And if he was here tonight, he would be extolling the virtues of church-going, not from a high religious point of view, but from a pragmatic, from an emotional point of view. And I want to finish this contribution of mine with a personal anecdote, which I think illustrates this point. In 2019, I was backpacking, like any Cambridge student, through Jakarta with my partner, a wonderful city, by the way, a behemoth of a city, I should say. It was late at night, it was dark, and we were looking for our hostel. We couldn't find it, we were lost. And completely unintentionally, this is true, we stumbled across the road on which the city's cathedral was located. And drawn forth like a moth to a flame, we had this yearning to go inside. Why? Because we were in a place that was unfamiliar to us, and it represented something very familiar, something where we felt we had a stake. Now, I'm not suggesting for one moment that there was something wrong with Jakarta. It's a wonderful place. And of course, this is what the point is that religious buildings as a space evoke such an emotional value, and that when we went in there, we felt so powerfully connected with it that it was quite overwhelming. And I wanted to make that point as my final point. Beyond also the fact that, coming back to my recommendation, which is your chapel service, whether or not to go. Well, as I've hopefully outlined, if you do choose to say yes to that option, you would be sharing in the splendor of church music, the comradeship of community, and the restorative value of quiet contemplation, thoughts and prayers, away from the trials and tribulations of modern life, all in an hour-long service. So, back to that free and volitional choice that I set out with, I implore you to say yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick, for those excellent remarks. I've seen a couple of tentative hands going up in different parts of the chamber, so I just thought I'd quickly clarify the rules. As a member, you are welcome to put your hand up and intervene at any time, but the key is to get the attention of the speaker. So you can say anything you want from point of information, will you give way on that point, listen here, whatever you want, but whatever gets the attention of the speaker. It is up to them whether they take it or not, but I've encouraged them all to take floor interventions. We move across to the opposition, and a good friend of mine, Laura Ryan. Laura is a research student at the Cambridge Institute for Medical Research, and she's also a member of Downing College. She won this slot through open audition. Laura, you have the ears of the House.
Thank you, James. I think it's always very difficult arguing against motions like this one. It's very easy for the proposition, as he so eloquently has done, to paint a lovely, optimistic picture of a compassionate, inclusive church and appeal to the values of tradition and community, and to sell you on quaint medieval English churches or that transcendent feeling that you get when you step inside a cathedral and listen to a beautiful piece of choral music. Whereas in some sense, we on this side of the aisle are Project Fear, doomed to delineate to you some of the most horrific subject matter that you're going to encounter in this chamber. But in another sense, it is easier than most motions on religion to argue the opposition tonight, because I'm in complete agreement with my proposition that to win this motion, I don't have to convince you to be an atheist. I don't have to convince you that religion itself is a negative force or is outdated. I only have to convince you not to support the Catholic Church or other Christian churches by attending their services. As my friend on the floor so eloquently described, this is a motion about institutions, not about theology, and whether or not we should support those institutions. The Catholic Church, which is obviously a global force, and the Church of England are very different institutions. So I'll talk first about the Catholic Church. Historical crimes committed by the Catholic Church are too expansive for me to cover. Helping influential Nazis escape after the full horrors of the Holocaust had been revealed, the abuse of women and children at mother and baby homes, and the oppression of members of the LGBT community, an ongoing sin which I expect my colleagues on this side of the chamber may expand upon. But I'm going to focus on crimes that the church is guilty of or complicit in as we speak, crimes that you do support, however passively, by attending their services. The cover-up of endemic sexual abuse of children by Catholic priests and ministers is so widely known about and so difficult for us to wrap our heads around because of the sheer scale and of how far removed it is from most of our experiences, that it's almost become thought of as an easy, cheap shot in debates about the Catholic Church, or that it somehow misses the point if the debate is about whether or not we should attend services. But this is baffling to me. How can endemic sexual abuse, mostly of young boys, and I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of victims, be less important than your attendance at church on Sunday? What moral salvation can you possibly receive from an institution that has facilitated and covers up such abuse? Yes.
How will not attending church services help to prevent the endemic sexual abuse of young boys?
I will explain. Thank you for your question. I'm just coming on to that. I would hope that there are some Catholics here today that would agree with me that since Jesus walked on earth, it seems his church has lost its way. My mum is an observant Catholic, and she's one of the best, most good-hearted people that I know. She's Irish and she's very frugal with her money, but one thing that she never fails to shell out generously for is the wicker collection basket at our local Catholic church every Sunday, or those little cardboard boxes that come around as part of various charity appeals. And I always wondered when I watched her folding banknotes and slotting them in, what does the church do with her money? For the most of the last century, the Catholic Church minimized the financial damage that was caused by paedophile priests by covering up the abuse and intimidating or shaming victims' families into silence. Lawsuits were hushed up out of court, and settlements were made in return for non-disclosure agreements. So how much money changed hands? Well, if we focus on just the United States, the church has so far paid well over $3 billion in settlements. Some say closer to $4 billion, and this figure is expected to at least double given recent legal changes which give victims more time to sue their abusers. I should say the survivors included in that figure comprise 5% of the estimated 100,000 US victims, and that's just in the United States. If you look at somewhere like France, there are an estimated 330,000 more. But despite their public sympathy for victims, the church by no means pays these settlements willingly. As the number of lawsuits climbed higher and higher in the mid-2000s, the church took a page out of the playbook of Fortune 500 execs and Big Pharma and started filing for bankruptcies. A Bloomberg investigation uncovered that in the decade leading up to 2020, the US Catholic Church shielded more than $2 billion in assets from abuse victims using bankruptcies. But it gets much worse. Contrary to their publicized support for abused children, the church has spent millions of dollars investing in lobbying against the interests of victims, with the amount that they're spending on this increasing year on year.
Point of information. Are there no secular liberal organisations in which child abuse takes place?
There most certainly are, but
Exactly. So is the question we're dealing with here that of child abuse or just a way of attacking the church? If your concern is child abuse, surely your attack should be considerably wider. For instance, the BBC might come under some investigation, which also takes a lot of money from people.
I suspect that should there be, and as there have been, charities where there is this level of endemic sexual abuse and this much of an institutional cover-up, they do lose people. People no longer give to those charities and people are imprisoned. It is obviously the case that this is not a... No, thank you. Sorry.
I must stress that some of these organisations are actually run by the state out of taxpayers' money. I mean, do you think that state children's homes are completely free of child abuse, for instance?
That is true, and I don't support those
But
organisations
then why
either.
are you not as exercised about that scandal as about
I'm
this?
equally exercised about, about that.
Excellent.
In the northeast US alone. In the northeastern US alone, more than $10.5 million of the church's funds went towards fighting legislation extending the statute of limitations for victims of child abuse. Bearing in mind these laws would have affected all victims of child sex abuse, not just victims of the clergy. What is compassionate or Christian about that? The Catholic Church holds tremendous wealth in land, building, artifacts, and currency, which I've never been quite sure that Jesus would approve of. Their net worth is estimated at somewhere between $10 and $15 billion, with a steady incoming cash flow from parishioners of $300 million a year. It breaks my heart to think of good, kind, caring people like my mum all around the world contributing their hard-earned money every week to a church that relies on that money flowing in to continue paying off victims, lobbying politicians to block abuse victims from receiving their compensation, and covering up sexual abuse. Financial support aside, many priests found guilty of abuse are simply moved to a different diocese, and some of them aren't moved at all and continue in services with children present. I haven't got time to talk about the AIDS epidemic and the very much ongoing role of the Catholic Church in worsening and prolonging it by taking the stance that contraception, by which I mean a small piece of latex, is a greater evil than spreading a virus that kills indiscriminately, a stance which many Catholics in Britain do not support. But I must move on to the Church of England. What do we think of when we think of the Church of England? Beautiful medieval stone churches, the vicar who's very popular on Twitter, Jerusalem, the greatest hymn of all time. These are essential parts of our cultural heritage, and they should be valued, I agree. But is the Anglican Church really as benign as your average habitual churchgoer thinks that it is? I won't delve into their discrimination towards the LGBT community or their opposition to the liberalisation of abortion healthcare. Yes. Yes, it very much does. It may seem that abortion legislation is a thing of the past in Britain because it's generally widely available, but for instance, in 2020, there was a COVID law that was brought into place allowing women to have medical early-stage abortions in their own homes, and that is about to be scrapped and was very, very widely condemned by the Church of England. But there's one particular issue which the Church's strong political influence has incredibly cruel consequences for thousands of Brits every year, and that is assisted dying. The ban on assisted dying is inhumane, it's uncommonly cruel, and it criminalizes compassion, a central tenet of the Christian faith. You may be surprised to hear that 80% of religious people in Britain support changing the law to allow for compassionate, regulated assisted dying. But what about those who speak on their behalf? Church of England bishops and the Catholic Church are right at the very forefront of opposition to the legalization of assisted dying in Britain. 26 active Church of England bishops sit as Lord Spiritual in the House of Lords, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, spoke of their complete unanimity in opposing a recent bill which would allow mentally competent adults with less than 6 months to live to die in a manner that they choose. The influence that Christian religious organisations have in British politics is unrepresentative of both the sizes of their congregations and of the views of the people who make up those congregations. Christendom is not dead, even in supposedly secular Britain. The poll revealed another disconnect between the church and its congregation. The majority of religious people thought it was wrong for senior religious figures to have lobbied MPs and to have actively campaigned against the ban. Less than a quarter of people of faith believed that active political intervention was the right thing for a church. It's clear that attitudes amongst the faithful in Britain are not a monolith, and that many do feel compassion towards terminally ill patients who desperately want to be able to die with dignity. But the church's stance is not nuanced, it's not uncertain, and it matters. It matters to those who are forced to suffer in immeasurable pain every day, and to their loved ones who would face up to 14 years in prison should they accompany their dying relatives to a country with more compassionate laws. So to conclude, if you're tempted by the Catholic Church for cultural reasons, because you like the opulent architecture, the gorgeous music, and the tradition, all of which I completely understand and I'm partial to myself, I would ask you this: is it worth supporting an organization that is complicit in the abuse of hundreds of thousands of children? An organization that has contributed so much to worsening and prolonging the AIDS epidemic for the sake of a piece of latex? Or for the Church of England, an organization that forms the bedrock of discrimination towards gay and trans people in this country and prevents the terminally ill from being able to die in a manner that they choose? And if you are strongly theologically Christian, I suspect convincing you to vote with this side of the house tonight might be a tough sell. But I would ask you this: what sort of God would condemn you for worshipping in a manner that avoids supporting a church that hoards massive wealth, that discriminates and persecutes, and that throughout history has been filled with some of the least godly, most selfish, and cruelest men in Europe? Can that church be anything like anything that Jesus had in mind? Jesus was a radical. He was the ultimate reformer. He despised the ostentatiously opulent in the face of poverty, and he protected children. What do you think he would say about his church if he came back tomorrow? And is a God for whom these institutional sins are less important than your attendance at church every Sunday really one who you would want to worship? I would ask you to vote with the opposition this evening.
Thank you very much, Laura. I would like to hear from some members. So, if you pop up your hand, we'll do proposition, opposition, and then abstention. 2 to 3 minutes. I'm seeing some people who auditioned to speak, and I'll make sure that I get to both of you. I'm going to go here first. I will make sure I get to you.
Thank you, James.
Name and college, please.
Tommy Shaw, Tomerton. Yeah. We heard from the first proposition speaker a kind of vision of cultural Christianity in which a defense of going to church largely rests on kind of aesthetic, utilitarian grounds. And I think, I find that very irritating. Because the Christian faith, the good news of the gospel, is that the Lord of the universe, the person who made the stars, made the heavens and the earth, loves each and every one of you. Each and every one, not the universe, not his chosen people, each and every one of you, sufficiently that he died on the cross for you. And the cross, crucifixion, is such a brutal way of dying that it was considered a mercy to break your legs so you die more quickly. This is the reason you should go to church. Not because of stained glass windows, not because of music, but because God loves you. Anything less is a farce. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm afraid I can't. You can give a floor speech. I can't do a point of information once the speech is over. But if you'd like to give a floor speech, I can jump in. I'm going to go to someone else who did an audition. And I will get round to as many people as I can. But in opposition, at the back of the room, please.
Sam Carling Christ. So I consider myself an atheist, but I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness. And I'll always remember how I used to have a nice lie-in on Sunday mornings, because me and my parents would be going down to Kingdom Hall, which is our church equivalent, at 10 o'clock, and, why get up before then? And sometimes, someone who was usually the life of the congregation would come in and sit at the back by themselves, and nobody would be allowed to talk to them for a few weeks, after which the person would either stop coming, disappear, or be treated normally again, as if nothing ever happened. And as I grew older, I slowly came to understand what was going on. This was a form of religious discipline called disfellowshipping. The person had done something awful that meant they were essentially removed from the religion. And while they were, nobody was allowed to talk to them, even their family, as a means to encourage them to repent, right whatever sin they'd committed, and come back into the fold. Anyway, what terrible things did these people do to deserve this fate of being shunned by friends and family alike? Must be pretty bad, right? Well, how about divorcing your abusive spouse? The religion says no divorce. Only grounds for that are adultery. Getting beaten up? Being abused physically, financially, emotionally, you name it? Your problem. You stood up in front of that altar and promised to be faithful to them, and if you break that covenant to God, well, then you've sinned. Anyway, I never thought that shunning was a risk to me, but I made a realization when I was 13 that completely and utterly changed my life, and that was that I'm gay. The religion certainly doesn't like that. Try to imagine for a moment what it's like to be raised being told gay people are evil, unnatural, abhorrent, vile, disgusting, any other slur you like, by your own parents, among others, and genuinely believing that in your heart as a result, only to find out that you're one of them. Imagine having absolutely nobody to talk to about it. One, because you're disgusted and ashamed of yourself, and two, because you're worried they'll rat your secret out to your parents and make you homeless as a result. That is exactly what I spent my early teenage years terrified of. And my parents still don't know, because they'd cut off all contact in a heartbeat. The broader point that I hope that story illustrates is that organised institutional religion has a terrifying power to make people do unspeakable things. I'm sorry, I need to get through this. It teaches you to blindly accept doctrine. It teaches you not to think. That's not unique to Jehovah's Witnesses, or even Christianity as a whole. It's widespread. There are other examples. Suicide bombers are probably one that comes to mind for a lot of people. It is absolutely terrifying that religion has the power to do that to people. And I, for one, would not go anywhere near an institution that can wield that sort of power. Thank you.
Thank you for that speech, Sam. Would anyone like to make a brief speech in abstention this evening? Well, just because of the tenacity, I'm going to go upstairs. Where are they? Yes. Yeah, you. Name and college, please.
Megan, and I'm from Homerton College. So I would say the difference between the debates that I thought we were going to have tonight versus the debates we are having tonight is that everything seems to be rather religiously based. And I would argue, I mean, I don't know if you can tell by, my voice, but I am American. And we have sort of the separation of church and state, which isn't necessarily as solidified as it is in the UK. And so even in UK schools, you can teach religion. And generally that's Anglican or even Catholic-based, but not necessarily Judaism or even, Muslim. And yes, sorry, I can't. Okay, yes.
I went to a British school and I was taught about Islam.
But which school is that in particular? Are you from Birmingham? No. Are you, out of curiosity, are you from Birmingham? Birmingham. But this is different. So I would say, because maybe not necessarily everyone here has sort of gone through that state per se, but I would argue the Trojan horse affair that absolutely polarized the country in 2014. Actually, go ahead. No, I'm not saying that. No. That's not the emphasis. The emphasis is particularly with the Trojan horse affair that was happening in Birmingham in 2014, is that the fundamental religion within those public schools was Islam, and that ended up being a point of radicalism that was then used by the government as an So I'll get back to you, sorry. That was used as a point of radicalism for Islam within this country, and that was used against many, generally majority Muslim teachers as an emphasis as why they couldn't teach in British schools. And so I'm saying the problem with just going to church, it's not necessarily just a religious-based argument, as it's becoming sort of apparent here that maybe this conversation is, but more so cultural. And the problem, I think, fundamentally, is that no one here is going to recognize the cultural differences between Christianity versus any sort of other religion, specifically in this, in this room. So,
Sure,
go ahead.
Are you making the case to go to church to prevent people getting access to radical Islam?
Absolutely not. No, no, no. No, I'm saying absolutely not. We should not, you guys, I'd say fundamentally, it should not be necessarily a choice of going to church or nothing else. I mean, I feel like there should be a general healthy atheism within everything. And again, it's the cultural issue so what you're arguing essentially to me is that you either go to church because you're Christian and you won't sort of convert to any sort of like radical, any other religion, or, I don't know.
Is the question that church is specifically the Christian church and not a synagogue, mosque? Is that what your complaint is, that we're solely focusing on church?
Absolutely, yeah.
No, I think that's it. Thank you very much for those remarks, Megan. I'm very conscious that lots of you want to speak this evening. I'm very conscious of that, so we'll do a slightly longer next round for interventions, but I'd like to come back to the paper speakers. And the second speaker on proposition this evening is Tim Farron. Tim has been the Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for, can we quiet down please? Has been the Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament for Westmorland and Lonsdale since 2005. He served as leader of the Lib Dems between 2015 and 2017, a period which covered the EU referendum and the subsequent general election. Tim, the floor is yours.
So, well, thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for having me. First time to take part in a Cambridge Union debate, so be gentle with me, even though I know that you won't. And this is also, 17 years in Parliament, the first time I've stood behind the dispatch box. But it won't be the first time that I probably lose a debate. But all the same, and my apologies to my teammates for taking a view that I'm not all that bothered whether I win tonight. The key thing is that a message lodges in the brain of at least one of you, and preferably more. Because what all of you do, certainly if you're arts and social science students and you address an essay question, the clever thing, the smart thing to do, the wise thing to do, is to challenge the assumption in the question. And I'm going to say this to you. What is church? And to me, church is not a building. And when Christians speak of church, they shouldn't speak about buildings. Yes, there are churches, but the church is the body of Christ. It's the people who believe in Jesus Christ across the whole of the planet Earth, and it always has done. Because the church is not the place you go to meet God. You don't have to be in church to be a Christian. And going into a church no more makes you a Christian than me going into Greg's makes me a pasty. You know, when all said and done, it is, so people will think that, so the temple, in Old Testament times, the temple was where the people met God, so to speak, through sacrifices. The God was veiled, literally, and he had that presence only in the temple. And once per year, the priests would go in, perform sacrifices, and there you had that brief moment of engagement with God directly. Jesus Christ is the Lamb of God for a reason. He died for all of your sins. They are all paid for, once and for all. And if you want him as your Lord and Saviour, he is like that. And then you're in the church, whether you're here, whether you're in Greg's, or whether you're in what we might call a church. So I want to encourage us just to think that if Jesus Christ did not exist, or if he's not the person that the New Testament documents say he is, then this house should just have a lie-in on a Sunday and not bother. Because I want to encourage you, though, to think that, I mean, for me, I didn't go to church till I was 18. I went once when I was 12 to annoy a parent, and it worked. Yeah, go for it.
Sorry, I just wanted to know, why would I go to an institution that calls me a sinner and tells me that I'm sinful? You know, why would I feel welcome somewhere that doesn't actually sound very inviting? Not just me, but anyone.
It's a great point, and the bottom line is, every single person who ever lived is a sinner. And that is a much overused or much misunderstood term, but it's to live in opposition to the God who made you. It's to want God's good stuff but not to want God. So that makes every single one of us a sinner. So yes, there is a sense in which believing in Jesus Christ is something that you do, and accepting the Bible is something where you accept that ego-crushing reality that you are not the king of the universe, that you are not the most important person who's ever lived. And Peter, all yours.
Point of information. By implication, you are saying that we must believe in the Bible, that you're defending the Bible. And the Bible says that if a man lies with a man, he is committing an abomination and he should be put to death. This is a biblical exhortation to kill LGBT plus people. How can we defend that?
So we cannot, but we must look at the Bible in context throughout. Is it the Word of God? Yes, it is. Is every single bit of it meant to be taken literally? Absolutely not. And here's the thing. If the Bible is not true, if God does not exist, if Jesus Christ is not who he says he is, then you don't need to worry about any of that stuff. So that is not a first... Of course, go for it. Hello.
What other way would you posit to possibly interpret
I mean, that's not what I'm going to seek to do tonight. And I'm not going to do it tonight for all sorts of reasons, but predominantly because what the Bible tells us is of a world which is fallen and sinful, and the treatment of people, whether they're minorities or majorities, to single them out, to treat them despicably, violently, is outrageous. And what the Bible takes us through is a story, a journey from creation to the present day and to a future point, where humanity is being united to a God who loves them and wants their perfect well-being forever. But I just want to I think we've already touched on this a little bit already. And certainly our friend who spoke, the former Jehovah's Witness back there, and I've had friends of mine who are Jehovah's Witnesses as well, that I think you've already touched. Because the thing is, this house would go to church. This guy didn't. As I say, I went once when I was 12 to wind up a parent, and it worked. And I didn't go again until I became a Christian when I was 18 years of age. But this house would go to church. There are people here who have been to church and say, no, thank you very much. I've been there and done that. And maybe you went to church. Okay, go on, yep.
You mentioned there in response to a point about a particular verse in Scripture that it doesn't matter. And I speak tonight as a Christian myself. And I'd just be concerned that you're mischaracterizing what the Scripture truly teaches about homosexual activity. And I think that's just a wrong way to go about trying to crank up support for this motion.
I mean, I don't think I've done that. I think what I'm saying is that I don't think I've done that at all. What I'm trying to do is look at why it is we would go to church, why it is you'd want to enter into the place where we learn about the God who loves us, who died for us, and who seeks us earnestly. I'll take one more and then I better make a bit of progress.
Sorry, yes, just you still haven't answered my question. It's why would I want to go somewhere where I don't feel welcome?
Well, you should feel welcome.
And being told that, I have committed sin since when I was born. What is welcoming about that?
But I think, what does sin mean to people? And does it mean the committing of individual acts that people disapprove of? That's not what I mean by sin. It is that status of being in enmity to God and seeking to put an end to that enmity to God.
But regardless of the definition of sin, it doesn't matter, because the question is, if I do not feel welcome.
Well, do you know what? I'm going to come to that right now, okay? But let me just go through 3 broad reasons. I'm being a bit indulgent, I think, with the President's time here, but 3 broad reasons why you would not go to church. And there are 3 broad reasons, probably because you have been to church. And reason 1 is you found it tedious and boring. Reason 2 is you found it offensive. Reason 3, you found something far worse that you spoke about and you touched upon. And I want to start with the last thing first. And you will not hear from me a defense of institutions or individuals who are guilty of abuse or covering up of abuse or seeking to exonerate people or to somehow protect the reputation of their institution rather than think about the victims. I'll be absolutely clear with you. The treatment that some have been victim of within the church is abhorrent, it is disgusting. Peter's right to say it happens in secular situations as well, but we're talking about the church. And the church should believe in repentance for itself as well as for those who are dear towards its faith. No justification for that whatsoever, utter condemnation for it. And maybe you found it offensive. Not abusive, but offensive. And I don't know why you would find it offensive, but I'm sure I can think of plenty of reasons why you might. So I don't want to assume that I know all the reasons why everybody here who may have been to church and found it offensive, found it so. But let me just talk about it in the general. Let's just assume for a moment that there is a God. And by the way, there'll be plenty of philosophers here, sort of professional and amateur, people who are philosophers who will think about these things. Is there a God? The metaphysical arguments for and against there being a God. Does creation, if you would call it creation, does the existence of the universe prove anything? Intelligent design? Is there a God? Let me get really simple about this. If Jesus Christ is who he said he is, if the resurrection happened, then there's a God and we know his name. And you can stop the search right there. But let's just go back. Go for it, Peter, yeah.
The key word in your little variation there was if.
Yes.
If.
There is.
So you're not saying there is, it's if. You're asking us to imagine, to believe, to take a speculative jump.
I believe for sure, but I am asking you to make a speculative jump for the sake of this discussion. And the speculative jump is this. If there is an almighty God, who is utterly transcendent, holy and perfect, and he spoke the entire universe into existence with his breath. And if you and I are flawed, and yes we are, and that God we encounter affirms everything we already think, then on that God, Richard Dawkins is completely right. He's a delusion. He's an extension of yourself. If that God disturbs you, contradicts you, utterly makes you feel uncomfortable, then you would expect him to. If you've been made disturbed or uncomfortable by the God you encountered, then maybe, just maybe, it's because you've encountered the real one. And boring, tedious, yeah, that's how I found it when I was 12 and I went to sit through a service. My fault probably more than the church itself. I remember very little of it. But is it tedious? Is it boring? When you look at the claims that Jesus made, people will talk about him being a radical, being a political leader and a revolutionary. We know a lot, if we will trust the New Testament documents, and some of the non-Christian contemporary writings about Jesus. We know a lot about this guy, and he was more than that. He was so much more than that. The claims he made are ridiculous and outrageous. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That is so utterly exclusive and utterly ridiculous. How can you marry that up with a guy who welcomed little children? How can you marry that person together unless there is something unbelievably spectacular about him and you'd want to know more about him? And this God, Tim Keller talks about this, that there will be both, I imagine, plenty of physicists in here, but if you imagine the gap between here and the sun, 93 million miles, is the width of a single piece of paper. Then you would think that the distance between the sun and the next star is the distance is a stack of paper 75 feet high. And the gap from this planet to the end of the cosmos, to this galaxy, is a stack of paper 350 miles high. And that's one of 100 billion galaxies in the universe that we know of. And that was spoken into existence by God. And that God loves you intensely. It says in Hebrews 12 that Jesus bore the pain of the cross, and we've heard about what that involved, for the joy set before him. And what was that joy? Was it being all right at the end? I need to finish. Was it the joy of being okay afterwards? No, because he had that before. Was it the joy of being with his Father? No, because he'd had that for eternity. So what was this joy that made it worthwhile enduring that agony and that pain? You. Being with you. That's that joy. That's that joy. Now, I am sure that God is who he says he is, that Jesus Christ is who he says he is. But let's just say, I've asked to wrap up, so I'm going to. When all said and done, if there is a 1% chance that what I have just told you is true, then this house would go to church because it would be mad not to go and find out. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you for taking so many interventions. Can we quiet down, please? Thank you. And we'll move to our second speaker on the opposition and our final student speaker for the night, Harry Sanderson. Harry is studying for a Masters of Law at Queen's College. He won this slot through open audition. Harry, you have the ears of the House.
Can I just ask before I begin, what's the college without a chapel? Hopperton. Okay. Lucy Cav as well. All right. I won't see you there on Sunday. So let me start by just giving a kind of summary of the debate as I've seen it. Now, Nick, like all good lawyers, made a good sort of sleight of hand where he put on his kind of cool preacher costume, his backwards cap and his six-string guitar and said, no. Going to church is not about God. It's all cool. It's fine. Come see the buildings. Come see the stained glass windows. Hating gays? Sure, whatever. We'll get to that later. It's about the building. It's great. It's fun. Come in. Right? Convincing, yes. Tim then stood up and said something, I think some of you might have noticed a very subtle difference, where he said, God is only in the church. The church is God. If you come to church, you are worshipping God because God is important. I'll say no more on that distinction, but I think there is one. I'll then turn to sort of pre-rebut the third speaker we have here. In the brief research I did for this debate, I went to the theist's Bible, if you will, not the actual Bible, but The Rage Against God by Peter Hitchens, released in 2010, reviewed very well, The Spectator calling it a magnificent, sustained cry against the aggressive secularism taking control of our weakened culture. Wait until, well, yeah. Wait until they find out what goes on at Homerton. So, to start, chapter 11, verse 1, and Peter, correct me if I'm misquoting you here. Those who reject God's absolute authority, preferring their own, are far more ready to persecute than Christians have been. Each revolutionary generation reliably repeats the savagery. Mr. Hitchens ends that chapter by saying that a militant secularism has taken over Britain. The rage against God, he says, is loose, indeed. And thus, I think, the battle lines for a debate of this sort are drawn. On the one side, we have the enlightened, the humble, the forgiving, the calm believers simply willing to spread the mystery of faith. On this side, we have the militant atheists following the school of Richard Dawkins and Steven Pinker, frothing at the mouth, mostly pale white virgins who have YouTube channels dedicated to destroying theists with facts and logic. Now, by my count, there is but one... Yes?
That's not in my book.
No. Merely the movement it helped start. Now, by my count, on this side, there is but one pale virgin. However, what I would like to push against is any summary of that debate across those lines. What I would like to advocate today is that there are gradients of Christianity. There are gradients of faith. I am not here to condemn anyone who believes. Rather, I am here to say that it is very dangerous to command how others praise. It is very dangerous to say, if you are a Christian, you must do this. To say, if you worship, it must be in this way. Yes, please. Well, is that right? Is that right? Saying we should not go to church as a house is not the same as saying one should not go to church. It's not the same as saying, as an individual, it should be up to us how we believe. It is not the same as saying everyone needs to worship in this way. And I'll return to that later. Thank you. So, I have three central points here. The first is that Christianity is not necessarily best represented by the church. Secondly, that worship is much broader than the church, than any church. And thirdly, and this is to your point, that faith is an individual pursuit. It is not for this house to decide where we go, it is for the individual. I mean, as long as the yeses don't get up, abstain all you like, but I'm feeling comfortable. So, the proposition, and I think Tim's debate got to this point very well, assumes to an extent that the church best espouses the values of theology. And the opposition has very clearly the proposition has very clearly elided those two positions, framing the church as God and God as the church. But what about when the church has been overcome by the personal, has been overcome by the political, has been overcome by greed? Laura's speech outlined that with some intensity, and I think we've had some very passionate floor speeches to that effect. Now, to be clear, this argument is, in my view, generous to Christianity. It says the crimes and misdemeanors of the church are not the crimes and misdemeanors of Christianity at large. They are people who have strayed from the faith and not upheld the faith correctly, rather than the faith speaking itself. But if you accept that argument, you have to accept the inverse, which is going to church will not lead you to the highest form of Christianity. Going to church is not necessarily, in substance, the best way to experience that faith. Now again, I don't need to give a laundry list of wrongdoings that the church has done. Again, I think the floor speeches have done that better than I could. I think if anyone considers their own personal life, they would have had some run-in, even if it's from a friend, of the church not fulfilling what we might think of as common sense, moral and ethical principles. And that's only at the really principled level. Let's talk about literally attending church. In 1959, of the around 100,000 churches in the American South, there were less than 24 black practitioners. Now, things are better today, I'll acknowledge that, but they're not great, let's face it. The church is not a particularly welcoming institution. We've already heard from someone that didn't feel comfortable in the church. We've all seen mostly American examples of people being pushed out of church. We saw Barack Obama rejected on the basis of his race by some, I should note, not all, but by some churches. So perhaps this house would go to church if it could, but it is very dangerous to universalize and say that this house is one being. Traditionally, perhaps it has been for the worse, but right now it isn't. This house would go to church if the church would have it, but I'm not sure it would.
On that point,
Please.
no, I know, yes, the Catholic Church is bad. Yes, we're segregated churches in America. But with that being said, in the UK, there are many LGBTQ accepting churches that do sponsor gay marriage. And churches nowadays are much more accepting. So why would this house go to one of those churches?
Yes, I think that's a fair point, and I should note that there are levels of progressivism within the church. I still think it's dangerous to choose the anecdotal case and not look at the institution in general. Yes, someone might attend a church as an LGBT person, but can they truly say that that institution is welcoming to them as a whole? Are they not finding solace with an enormous caveat to who they are?
Point of information.
Please.
Can you clarify? It seems to me like there are vast differences depending on your sect of Christianity. If you are a Catholic, surely it's centralized within the Pope. However, if you are a Protestant in the United States, for instance, the degree to which churches are centralized is clearly not the case. So would this not challenge your argument on some level?
Look, I think that's fair, and that's a fair division to make. I still think it's a dangerous game to say that outside of Catholicism, individual churches have their own regime.
But is there an institutional church in places which accept Lutheran practices, which aren't necessarily rooting, the reception of Scripture in papal edict?
Look, I will happily concede there are more progressive churches. I think they are still rooted in the doctrine and habits of a Christianity which, again, as we've heard, has some poisonous roots. Now, I don't want to stand here and make some crude caricature of Christians as not doing anything to dig those up, but the fact is they haven't done enough. And even if we can name the positive case, it is a very weak branch on which to rest the motion that we should go to church.
Point of information?
Yes.
Sorry.
No.
But you mentioned the diversity of the house, which I thought was a very interesting and relevant question to ask, because then with regards to this debate and deciding whether to go to church or not, surely the limited diversity in the voices, especially on the proposition side, is going to create an incomplete argument, because there are not really many different voices explaining exactly what the arguments for or against would be.
I think that's very, very true, and that's probably something to take up with the union itself. I think it helps my argument, to be honest. Yes, look, I think we can always do with more voices. I think the proposition side certainly could. But I don't claim to speak for everyone. I really don't. And please.
Yeah, just to help you out, really, and it's a very good point. So we are fairly unrepresentative, we three white fellows here. But I just want to point out that the majority of adherent Christians on planet Earth today live in Africa and Asia. And the balance of the church assumed to be white, it isn't in reality.
Yes, sure. Look, I think, to be honest, those are fair points. I think they get away from my main point, which really rests more on yours, is that I'm not pretending to speak for everyone. In fact, I'm saying the House should not speak for everyone. And this motion assumes a body politic which just doesn't exist, and in many places just isn't welcome. Thank you. Look, I'll spread through this second point, which is this motion, and I don't think this has really been touched on sufficiently, it assumes that church is the form of worship. Now, it's easy to walk through Jesus College and St. John's College and Trinity's College and Christ's College of our humble president and think that the church is the default forum, think that Christianity is the way to worship. Now, I think this point is fairly simple to make, but if the motion is this house should go to church, why is it not that this house would go to a synagogue? Why is it not that this house would go to temple, to a vihara, to a pagoda, to a kandi? Why can there not be a more open, international, and heterogeneous form of worship? Now, if you vote for this motion, what you're doing, I'll keep going, sorry, I've taken a few. What this motion is saying, it is fettering worship to a Western conception of Christ, a conception which is rich and complex, but far from perfect and far from universal. Now, Cambridge doesn't do incredibly well for diversity, but it isn't absolutely without it. And there is, I think, a growing and healthy mix of religious diversity in this very university. To vote that this house would go to church, let's not be mistaken, is to exclude those other faiths. I'll come to my final point, which is that I disagree with the philosophical foundation of this very motion. Why, as Christians, must we proselytize? In the Jewish faith, there is no proselytization. Those who come to Judaism are expected to come themselves. When did Christianity become something to be sold or demanded rather than communicated with or experienced? Why must you stand up and say, you should go to church? Now, some of us are of faith, but that faith is ours. It is subjective rather than objective, personal rather than universal. And for that reason, the vote must be no. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harry. We return to the members, and I'll try and do a slightly longer round, but can we please keep these interventions to 2 minutes? Would anyone like to make a case in proposition this evening? I'm going to go to the gentleman there because he auditioned too.
Jason, St Edmund's College. This motion commands each one of us to interrogate it intelligently in separating the bad acts of people from religion and religion from that most cherished national possession, a church. However much they may be intimately connected, they are in fact different. Church heirs are custodians of the past, inherited from our collective ancestors. They transmit a sense of continuity. In them, I've come to learn of their influence, for good or for ill, on all things for which we in this house give serious thought. Monarchy, civil rights, feminism, war and peace, education, the place of minorities, and much else besides. What's more, the beauty in art, architecture, colour, choir and ritual has a profound impact on the supple attendee, whether they are a worshipper, tourist, historian, or someone taking refuge on a rainy day. I too readily enjoy homilies and hymnals, but unlike the faithful, I find pleasure in some of the sins they steadfastly decry. All this, Mr. President, despite my being a non-believer. I'm not a Christian. I never pretend to be. To pass this motion is to stand with the minority of the church-going population, a measly 11% according to reputable sources. By going and seeing what the other is doing in church, we do become better acquainted to build bridges of communal trust and harmony, and in those areas of disagreement, a settlement based on tolerance is easier to achieve. These others for whom church is an essential part of their faith may today be our acquaintances, friends or colleagues, but what tomorrow? Our lovers, children, our most intimate friends? This house would go to church, if not in solidarity with others, then for the maintenance of one's own openness of mind, for the satiation of spiritual and emotional needs, to awe at the aesthetics and customs of these special places which they so effortlessly radiate. And what then? Church today? How about mosque tomorrow, or a synagogue the day after, or for our friend over there, a Birmingham school? Broader principles are at stake. I commend this House vote for the motion.
Thank you, Jason. Who would like to make a speech in opposition this evening?
Hiya, I'll keep it short. I've never done anything like this before, so it's going to be messy. I'm Saoirse, I'm at Girton College. Yeah, Girton. So I was a Catholic, so I can see the pros of going to church. I've got many benefits from going to church, made amazing friends, had amazing experiences, and quite frankly, wouldn't be here if it wasn't for going to church. And church is a lot about solidarity. And I went, all of my friends and myself, if we were reading the Bible as it is, would not be welcome there. It was the community that welcomed us into the church. And we've all had some quite unpleasant experiences there. Now, I think church was the community of all of the people. And in solidarity with everyone, I don't think it was the church that brought us all together. We just all stumbled into the same building and we all got along, and that was great. So those were the benefits. But together, together, I think that the church has a lot of problems, considering so many of us would be rejected, and personal friends have had some very horrific experiences in the church. And I think until those can be solved, that this house should not go to the church because it has too many issues. That's all.
Thank you, and I'd like to add my personal thanks to whoever opened the door. That is just a brilliant breeze. A speech in abstention. That was the first hand just there, please. Can we get a microphone, name and college?
Test. There we go. Oh, shit. Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Well, apologies for my French. I would just like to say the reason why I'm going in abstention is, while I certainly sympathize and relate to a lot of the stories and comments about feeling excluded or not welcome in a church, myself coming from an incredibly Orthodox Muslim background and sometimes feeling like even my own family wouldn't love me if they knew me for who I was, I entirely understand why some people might feel harmed or especially offended by what the church may represent. But what I've also seen, and I'm drawing analogies to Islam in this case, the beauty and the community that a lot of these institutions may represent. I've seen people smile, cry, fall in love, enjoy their times at these institutions like they never have in any other places. And I feel at the same time that should also be respected. While I feel like if I walked into a church, I might melt a little bit because of all the blasphemy I've committed, I'm sure that other people find themselves incredibly welcome and see the church as a place that invites them with open arms. And I feel like as a house, we should respect that. We should respect the freedom of those who want to believe in God and angels and all that stuff. And we should also find respect and love for those who would rather spend their Sunday nights at Lola's. It all depends on what the individual wants to do. And I don't think as an institution that prides itself on being international, multicultural, a place of freedom of expression and where people come to educate and nourish themselves, should nourish themselves intellectually, should support an institution that can be divisive or indivisive, but at the end of the day, I feel like the House should stay out of religious matters because these are far too contentious, and we should understand that as Cambridge students, we should be given the responsibility as we are mature enough to make decisions on whether or not the church should be within our lives. And that's why I believe the House should abstain from any significant or divisive or decisive claims on whether or not we should go to church. Thank you very much.
I'm going to do a second round. We're going to limit it to a minute because we need to push for time. Anyone in proposition? Was the very, very first hand, and it was up well before I'd said anything. So the person in the middle along that row.
Yeah, my name's Jack Fritchie. I'm from Hughes Hall. And I would just like to remind everyone here, and I think this hasn't quite been brought up yet, the radicalness of the idea that we should move away from religion and move away from the church. Every single society that has ever existed before our own was founded on some form of cultic worship. The oldest human structures that we know about at Göbekli Tepe are temples. In Rome, it was the cult of the paterfamilias. In the Odyssey, the fundamental distinction is between the societies which cultic worship has collapsed and have devolved into hedonistic consumption, and the societies where libations are still poured out to the gods. Why did our ancestors know this was important? They knew it was important because I would submit to you that there are two fundamental ways that we as human beings could look at the world. The first way, the theistic way, is that this human experience we have, where we encounter aesthetic realities, moral realities, the phenomenon of purposeness that pervades everything, is not an illusion. It in fact reflects the way the world really is at its deepest level. In a sense, it is as if humans, our creation, becoming conscious of its deepest intimations and its deepest movements. And this is why our ancestors, as Aristotle said, the soul is the home of the forms. And this is why our ancestors, through art and through liturgy, directed us toward this reality, to form a community that was formed around a common good. The only alternative to this is the idea that this human experience of morality, aesthetics, and purpose is radically discontinuous with the way the world really is. That it is merely a fleeting passion. And I think Milton Satan put this very well when he says, oh, I suffer, but it's not because I'm in hell or I'm damned or justice or anything like that. That's all bullocks. What's really, it's just a subjective state of mind that I'm in. And we can try to brush this under the rug, and we could try to say, okay, well, we could all pursue our private pleasures and reject any notion of the common good. But ultimately what happens is that when we all pursue our private pleasures, we come up against an obstacle, and that obstacle is other people who do not share those wishes. But ultimately, what I'm saying is that if we reject transcendence and we reject religion, all we are left with is nihilism and barbarism, and you can see it in the way that our society can modify as human beings today. Thank you.
Sorry. Would you like to speak in opposition? I interrupted, so why don't you make a floor speech? Less than a minute. Name and college, please. Can we get a microphone just here?
Very short. It's Alex Horan at Tatchell. Just in response, are you under the impression that people can't be good without religion? Because if that's the case, I think you lack morals and not God.
I'm desperate to hear what Mr. Grace has to say, but we're going to leave it to the bar afterwards because you have far too many opportunities. There's a hand at the back there, which I'm going to go to.
Max Doe, Trinity Hall. I'll be quick, James. Well, first, props to Laura Ryan and Sam Colling for some excellent speeches against the motion. I'm going to speak in abstention because while I admit that this House shouldn't force all of us to go to church, Sam and Laura talked about the sort of disgusting crimes churches have committed in the name of God, and that's completely unacceptable. But for some people, church is so important. There are some people, as an HSPS, I have to talk about the civil rights movement in America. for a people who, for centuries, faced slavery, segregation, discrimination, institutional, all sorts of institutional offences. They didn't have much institutions to respect or to find solace in or to find. No, because we're lacking time. I imagine you'll agree with the end of my speech. To find a safe space in. But Black Americans in the civil rights movement found that space in the church. I'm not saying all churches, but their churches. When Rosa Parks got kicked off a bus in 1955, the Montgomery bus boycott didn't start in a town hall. It started in the church, and that's where Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his first sermon, and that's when over 98% of the Black Montgomery population decided to boycott. When the KKK and racist groups wanted to push back against the civil rights movement, they didn't sort of petition their town halls, they committed all sorts of crimes, but the number one thing they did was they bombed church. The Birmingham bombings, but Birmingham in America, not Birmingham in Britain. The church, for some people, is such an important vehicle for social and political progress. And I'm not saying we should all go to church, but for some of us, it's so important. Thank you.
I'm afraid I've got to go, I think. I'm really sorry I've got to move on. I am sorry. Please keep putting up your hands. It's great to see so many people want to intervene, but I should probably crack on. I'm excited about the final two speakers we have this evening. And in proposition, our penultimate speaker is Peter Hitchens. Peter is a journalist, author and broadcaster, is a columnist for the Mail and Sunday, and has written a number of books, such as The Abolition of Britain and The Rage Against God. Peter, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, long ago, when Peter was thin, and more importantly, I was thin, we took part in a terrible event, which was a by-election in which he stood in Bermondsey, in which I and a number of other members of the more raucous part of Fleet Street gave Peter a very hard time, for which I've many times expressed regret, sometimes straight to his face, and for which I am ashamed. One of the reasons I'm ashamed is that in the period between the by-election and now, I embraced the Christian faith and learnt what I ought to be ashamed of. I would not, of all the people in this room, the person to whom I would most address the wish that he would go to church would be Peter himself, though I'm pretty certain I know why he wouldn't, because he is in very much of God's party without knowing it. I would say that he is a person, as I know, of considerable physical and moral courage, who has endured vilification on a terrible scale and has come through it triumphantly and shown to people that these things are virtues beyond price. And I absolutely want to say that I wish, of all the people in this room, I could persuade him. Actually, I'm not, a lot of people here I don't really want to persuade at all. I'm not like Tim. I have a suspicion, he may correct me here, that Tim's church is a bit happy and a bit clappy. I suspect that the hymns are pretty awful and they have carpet tiles. And that's not the kind of church I want you to come to. One of the reasons I'm not terribly concerned about priestly child abuse is that the church that I go to, first of all, during the original lockdown, the church wardens went to the authorities and said, why are you telling us to socially distance? The church is so empty, we stand so far away from each other, we couldn't possibly infect each other with anything. Anyway, it's not just that. I doubt if any of us is under 60, and as we shuffle tortoise-like across the flagstones, I think the possibility of any sort of child abuse is pretty limited. It is the sort of church which Philip Larkin referred to in his great poem, Church Going. Larkin, I believe, is another of those people who was of God's party without knowing it. What he advised people to do was to do as he did, was to make sure there was nothing going on before he went in. So much of what goes on in church I find quite offensive, actually. I do find that a lot of forms of modern worship are absurd and ridiculous and banal. And what I want when I go to church is to have the the banalities and the stupidities and the crassness and the conventional wisdom of the day disturbed, and strongly disturbed by the rhythms of the past. And actually some of them include fear, because the thing that I most strongly feel, and I feel, of course, obviously more day by day at the moment, is that the thing which we must say to each other every day is, remember that you must die. And in coming to terms with that, you perhaps have to think more seriously, as Philip Larkin said you should, about life and about the universe and about everything. And the point about going to church is that it stimulates these things greatly. It is a place of beauty, of silence, of contemplation, of poetry. And some of the best poetry in the world has been written in and for churches. If you were to attend, be lucky enough to slip behind the pillar, or go, for instance, to King's College Chapel for evensong, whichever side of the greatest screen in Europe, north of the Alps, you sat, you would hear all kinds of extraordinary things. One of the things that you would hear if you were a person who felt that social justice was neglected was the Magnificat, in which the Virgin Mary calls upon, speaks of a God who will scatter the proud in the imagination of their hearts, put down the mighty from their seat, exalt the humble and meek, fill the hungry with good things, and send the rich empty away. This is immensely subversive, and if it is taken seriously by anybody, it teaches you enormously important things about what actually is the difference between the stupidities, so often, of utopian or indeed bureaucratic politics, and of serious thought about the world in which you live and the way in which you treat other people. And the question of sin, and of not going to church because you're a sinner and you think the church should be horrid to you because you've been a sinner. The first thing which the proper Anglican is required to do at the beginning of both evensong and morning prayer is to confess his or her sins and to say, amongst other things, that he or she is a miserable sinner, because we are. In the service of Holy Communion, we say the remembrance of the terrible things that we have done is grievous unto us. The burden of them is intolerable, which in my view it is, and the older you get, the more intolerable it gets. Now, the people I'm trying to address here are people who are self-confident, ambitious, intolerant, atheistically inclined, perhaps a bit arrogant, sure of themselves, sure of their careers and futures. Very like me, and even more like me when I was a student 50 years ago. Those are the kinds of people who I think should be going to church because they would benefit so much from it. Yes, indeed. Sorry, where are you? You've got a light behind you like an interrogator. No, angels don't look like that.
Were I inclined to contemplate these big ideas, I suggest, I'm happy to come here, where I can interject the speaker at the pulpit, where we talk about these things in an interactive way with no authority, and where we talk about the things of the day. The reality is, going to church is when we think about the big things, you hear a man speak who is very authoritative, who presents you with the truth, you cannot interject, and it is not current and the same dogma they have for the last several thousand years. So, if you want to think of these big ideas, every reason you should come here and participate here does not apply to the church, so why should we bother?
Well, in terms of interjecting, I think you should ask Peter, who I think on one occasion interrupted the Archbishop of Canterbury in mid-sermon. Is that not so? You can do it if you want to. It won't necessarily make you popular, but if it's your thing... See, Peter is he's not in some dungeon in Lambeth Palace. He's out. He's served his time. It's okay, you can do that. But it would possibly undermine the purpose of being receptive to things which you otherwise wouldn't be taking in, because the rest of the world, honestly, is not very much like the contemplative nature of religious worship, or the poetry that you will hear, or the discussion of the greater subjects. In Norwich Cathedral, not far from here, a pleasant train ride away, there is a favourite sculpture of mine, it's a rather crude carving of a skeleton on a wall. He's grinning quite merrily and seems to be capering, and underneath it says, "As I am now, so shall you be, as you are now, so once was I." I live with that knowledge constantly, and it keeps reminding me of the importance of being concerned about other things. If you are the sort of person who wants to change their world, who wants to tell other people what to do, who wants perhaps to drive in tanks across somebody else's border and rearrange his country. Church is not for you. The point about church is that it sets out not to reform the world, but to reform the person who embraces the religion. And I just think that it's been for me such an experience of beauty, thought, and contemplation that I would be neglecting my duty as a human being and as a citizen and as a journalist if I didn't tell people that this is something they would be well advised to do. You may be disappointed, you may turn away, you may find that it repels you in certain ways, but if you've never even tried, then you're simply neglecting something very important. As even Philip Larkin did it, and he was a man who thought he hated God. And do you know why he wrote the poem Church Going? Because when he was touring Ireland one day, he found a thing which he'd never seen in England. And the thing that he found was a church which had been abandoned and was rotting, and the roof had gone, and the windows were out, and it was full of bats. And instead of being pleased as an atheist, he was surprised to find how distressed he was that something of this kind had happened, that something had gone missing, which he was so used to seeing in the England that he lived in, that when he saw it destroyed and gone, he realized what an immense loss it would be if it were not there. And of course, if you don't go there, it will die. And if it dies, then the churches will eventually fall empty, be turned into flats and restaurants and bars and whatever else it is they become. And I just end simply by saying a couple of things, which one of them is, both of them which seems to me to be appropriate to this evening. One of them is the collect for aid against all perils said every night in Church of England churches. And thinking of what is now going on in certain parts of the world, I would invite you to listen to what it says. Lighten our darkness, we beseech thee, O Lord, and by thy great mercy defend us from all perils and dangers of this night, for the love of thy only Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. What is also said night and morning in every church is the following: give peace in our time, O Lord, because there is none other that fighteth for us, but only thou, O God. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. President, I urge you to vote for the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for those powerful remarks. It's my pleasure to ask another Peter to wrap up proceedings this evening, Peter Tatchell. Peter is a lifelong campaigner and social activist on issues of human rights, LGBTQ+ liberation, democracy, civil liberties, social equality, environmental protection, and global justice. Peter, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, thank you so much, and thanks to all the speakers here tonight. We've had a debate, we've heard different points of view, and at the end of this, you will decide. I speak as someone who has quite often gone to church, but usually uninvited. Some of you, if you read your history, will know that in 1998, I went with my colleagues from the LGBT+ group Outrage into the pulpit of the Archbishop of Canterbury on Easter Sunday to call out the then Archbishop Dr. George Carey over his refusal to meet with the lesbian and gay Christian movement and his public advocacy of laws that discriminate. We did not interrupt the sacred parts of the service. We waited until his sermon. We calmly walked into the pulpit and held up placards decrying the Archbishop for his support for legal discrimination against LGBT+ people. I then delivered an unscheduled alternative sermon on the theme of discrimination is not a Christian value. For my sins, if some call it that, I was arrested and charged under the Ecclesiastical Courts Jurisdiction Act of 1860, formerly part of the Brawling Act of 1551. And under this legislation, I was charged with indecency in a church I hasten to add, I did not drop my trousers. Indecency under this legislation was an interruption of a minister of religion in the course of his sermon. I could have been fined £5,000 and sent to prison for 6 months. The magistrate accepted it was a brief, peaceful, dignified protest, and I was fined the princely sum of £18.60. The magistrate's comical reference to the 1860 Act under which I'd been convicted. Anyway, I digress. I grew up in the church. You know, my parents were hardcore evangelical, Protestant, Pentecostal fundamentalists. They are proud. For them, every single word in the Bible is the literal word of God. To be gay was on a par with rape or murder. They were very, very extreme. I went to church every Sunday. I went to Sunday school. In my middle teens, I became a Sunday school teacher. So I know the church back to front. I know what it says. I also know what it does. And often there's a very big difference. We hear often high-sounding moral calls to action. Good in theory, but often the practice is very different. And I think we will have heard many, many times instances where the church has said one thing, preached something, and then itself done something very, very different, and often quite dark, as we've heard tonight. Peter, in his delivery a few moments ago, said that the purpose of the church was not to change the world, but to change the heart and mind of the individual. And that, to me, was part of the problem why I left the church. Because I was called to piety, to not swear, not drink, not go dancing, not do any of those worldly things, but just to content myself with personal salvation. While around me I saw poor people, hungry, badly housed, people suffering because of an unjust world. And for me, in my teens, I'd never heard of liberation theology, but in my own mind, I began to think that is what Christianity should be about. The Sermon on the Mount, love thy neighbor as thyself, be my brother and sister's keeper, be a good Samaritan.
Why do you quote the scriptures selectively? You wish to take some parts of it, and yet you wish to reject others. That's completely inconsistent.
I'm talking about my change. I'm on a journey. I went through all that period, and now, indeed many decades ago, came to the conclusion that all religion, not just Christianity, is irrational superstition. It is not based on science or fact. It's not provable. It requires a faith which has no basis in reality. So I have rejected that and come to a humanistic understanding of the world rooted in science and reason. And I will come back to that in a little while. I want to say that the motion before us is this house would go to church. It is an exhortation, a recommendation. It's not saying you must go to church, but the implication is that it's something that we should do, that we would go to church. So it is giving an encouragement that people should go to church. Now, we've heard from the other side about the great architecture, the stained glass, the beautiful ornate carvings. Sure. But that is very different from religion. That is about physical beings, physical artifacts. If you want to hear great music, go to a Mozart or Beethoven concert. If you want to see beautiful art, go to an art gallery. If you want to go and see marvelous stone carvings, go to a sculpture park. We don't need church to enjoy these beautiful things.
Can we not do both?
You could do both, but what you seem to be saying is that the church has these particular unique things that would therefore require or encourage or make us inclined to go to church. And I'm saying that there are other ways of enjoying these things apart from going to church. The other side also, particularly yourself, sir, made great emphasis of trying to move the debate away from theology and religion to the physicality of the church. But of course, Tim Farron, a lay preacher, I believe, brought the matter very strictly back to theology and religion. And that is the problem. You cannot take the church in abstract. It's in a cultural context. And the cultural context is of theology, a set of beliefs rooted in a series of what I would say are dogmas handed down through ancient texts over many, many years. And I think that that is not the right way to proceed, that we are better than that we have the capacity for reason, for scientific analysis, hypotheses, proof and evidence, to look at the way we are in the world based on facts and evidence. And of course, using our own reason. We don't need God to be good. We can be good without God. We can be good and do good things to others without recourse to religion. And of course, if you look at one of the great, great works of theory or principle today, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, this was not a religious document. It was a document devised collectively by people all over the world. Hello?
This is a fundamental Christian idea. Universal human rights is built on a foundation of the Judeo-Christian world and worldview. So how would you respond to that?
Well, you tell that to the black Africans who were enslaved with the blessing of the church. You tell that to LGBT plus people who've been persecuted for centuries by the church. You tell that to people of other faiths who are victims of the sword of the Christian church during the Crusades. I think we have to be very, very clear that the church has a long history of very bad deeds.
How is it that we judge that the terrible things which the church sometimes does are evil? How is it that we have a category of good and evil at all? If we have no absolute basis for morality, then we are like a man in an avalanche who doesn't even know which way up he is. And likewise, the universe, the whole impulse towards science was based upon the idea that there was a rational and purposeful universe that was explicable. That is where science came from. I think to claim that either reason is unreligious or that morality can be contrived out of nothing at all is simply mistaken. And are you making a point of information to me while I'm making a point of information? I just want to be clear. Is it me or him? Well, do I have your permission to say?
Joe, is your point of order regarding this?
No, is that all right?
Fine. No, I'm sorry. Can't let.
Okay, well, I thought it was a bit elaborate.
You make a point, but I would say, very clear in my understanding, the rational humanist view of the world is not rooted in religion or ideas of good and evil. It's about how we treat other human beings. And of course, many religions have made pronouncements on these matters as well. But for humanists and atheists, people who do not believe in faith, they have come to a conclusion not rooted in what a holy text says or what the church or any other religious institution says. They're based it upon reason, ethics, evidence, and science. Very quickly.
I just think we should come back to that point that the gentleman over there raised, because if you look at the ancient philosophers, even in Greece, they would not believe that a slave has the same dignity as another human person, or that a woman, were considered, equal human beings. Yeah. Aristotle didn't, believe that at all. He thought they were just, some sort of subhuman thing. So it's really through the Judeo-Christian worldview that this has become so ingrained in our culture over 2,000 years that we can now judge things in this way. If we didn't have that, then even a humanist, argument couldn't even exist
have that?
So.
I mean, that is a big leap and a conjecture. To say that it is only out of the Judeo-Christian religion and culture that these ideas evolved is a nonsense. Clearly, there are people in non-Christian, non-Judeo religions who have come to similar conclusions. And when we look at, for example, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we see that people from all different cultures, faiths, and no faiths came to a consensus about what these fundamental human rights should be. Not rooted in religion, but rooted in reason and rationality, how to make a fair and just world. I have to wind up, but if you give me a bit more time.
Peter, honestly, I believe you're one of the most moral people I'm aware of. I do not think for a minute that people who are atheists are less moral than people who are believers, or even necessarily that our society has adopted human rights just because a religion has imposed on it. What I'm suggesting is that you misunderstand where your morality comes from. Because if you are an accident of the universe, what you think is right and wrong is totally and utterly arbitrary. And in 100 years' time, people might think something completely different. How can there be human rights if there is no natural law?
It is absolutely true that our concept of human rights is evolving. So when, for example, the United Nations Declaration was written, or indeed the European Convention on Human Rights was written, there was no understanding of the human rights of disabled people, of LGBT plus people, and many others. So sure, in 100 years' time, concepts of human rights may evolve further. But I'm very happy for that evolution, knowing it will come based on human experience, reason, and understanding, not on historical ancient dogma. I just want to finish by making a couple of points. First of all, I acknowledge there are many good people of faith. And some of my heroes in human rights have been people of faith. Dr. Martin Luther King, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. These are people of faith who have used their religion for good. But this motion is not about individuals. This is about the church in its generality, its collectivity, its universality. So if we say that this house would go to church, the implication is that we are endorsing or supporting the church and what it stands for. This is not about individuals. This is about the collective of the church. And we are not talking about individuals. We're talking about the church as a whole, what it stands for. It is a recommendation, this motion. It cannot be separated from the political and cultural context, from theology, from the history of the church and what it's done. It is an implied endorsement. And I would say that we should not endorse this institution. And moreover, as has already been pointed out, this motion is exclusionist. It says this house would go to church. It doesn't say this house would go to the church, the synagogue, the temple, and the mosque. So by voting for this motion, you are voting for an exclusion. You're privileging Christianity over other faiths. And for these reasons, I urge you to vote against the motion.
Peter, thank you very much. I thought that was a marvellous debate. I let it run over, and I frequently do that. I was very interested in what not only the paper speakers had to say, but also what members had to say. If you think that that is a bad policy, come and tell me in the bar. We vote with our feet here. There's an aye door, a no door, and an abstain door. If I could just ask the guest speakers to stay here just for a moment. But can we give them a round of applause? Thank you very much. Well, Good debate. Well done. Good debate. Thanks so much. Good evening.